Hello everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, Health Science Talk Series in our 50th anniversary year. My name is Alexander Jigensheimer. I'm UNU-INWEH's Knowledge Management Advanced Operations Assistant, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Science Talks. For those who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk showcases the diverse, policy relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. These sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how the science translates into real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Before we begin, I would like to share a few quick administrative announcements. So today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. The video will be made available in an open access format following the event, and you can find recordings of all of our previous science talks on demand via our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/inway/science-talks. And as always, I would like to conclude with an interactive Q&A session, so please feel free to post any questions in the group chat at any point during the presentation, and we'll address as many as possible towards the end of today's session. I would also like to highlight our new YouTube live stream option, which makes it easier for everyone to join our science talks. So there's no need to register to watch live. Simply go on the UNU YouTube channel and click on our profile picture to access the stream. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Raphael Ayembiri. Dr. Ayembiri is a research fellow in environmental governance and justice at UNU-INWEH and an assistant professor in the Department of City Planning at the University of Manitoba. His work sits at the vital intersection of environmental justice, critical mineral governance, resource planning, and human rights. With extensive academic and research expertise across both North America and internationally, Dr. Ayembiri's research examines how rapid resource extraction from global green transitions impacts land-connected communities, indigenous people, and environmental defenders. In today's talk, Dr. Ayembiri will present findings from the Global Archive of Critical Mineral Conflicts. He will examine how environmental defenders document ecological change and challenge visual assessments, yet frequently face severe criminalization, repression, and violence. He will unpack the connection of an epistemic accountability gap and concludes by proposing a recognition, resourcing, protection, and answerability, short RRPA framework, as a basis for strengthening justice and accountability in environmental governance. So, everyone, please welcome me in joining Dr. Raphael Ayembiri for today's science talks. The stage is yours.
Okay. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we could hear you.
Okay, awesome. All right. Thank you for that generous introduction, and it's my pleasure to be able to join you, although it's online. I was in Ontario a few weeks ago, and I was hoping to come in person, but failed at the end, so I'm still looking forward to coming and see all of you in person. So today I'm going to be presenting some of my recent work on what I term epistemic accountability within the green transition. The rest of today, what I hope to make a case for is that epistemic justice needs a much stronger emphasis on accountability. If we are to address the violence and injustices faced by land-connected people, such as indigenous communities and peasant landholders within the context of the green transition. For epistemic justice, what it simply means in this context is that we need to recognize and to respect diverse forms of knowledge, especially knowledge that is produced or comes from historically marginalized groups. And I will mostly be focusing on indigenous communities and peasant landholders, collectively called land-connected peoples. And if you will permit me, I would like to borrow one of the phrases from the recent Critical Minerals report by this institute. And I would like to say that if we want to avoid creating new sacrifice zones in the name of the green transition, then we need better knowledge accountability in order to do so. Okay, great. So I'm going to be developing this argument in 3 stages. I will begin by sharing results from a synthesis of recent works at the intersection of the green transition, knowledge politics, and justice for land-connected peoples. I'll also then move on to present some empirical analysis about how environmental defenders employ knowledge-based or epistemic strategies to pursue justice and just outcomes in green transition projects, while at the same time often being exposed to violence in the process. And finally, I will look at the current policy landscape currently used to advance epistemic justice with the hope of identifying what is currently still needed to move us from the current paradigm of inclusion towards what I would like to call accountability. So the green transition is understandably a very broad term, and people often use it in very different ways. For example, in energy policy, it often means moving away from fossil fuels towards low carbon energy alternatives. But others also use it more broadly to include changes to transport, industry, land use, and even biodiversity conservation. For today's talk, I intend to use it more narrowly to specifically mean rapid and often policy-driven rebuilding of our energy system around renewable power, electrified transport, battery storage, and other great networks that help connect all of these together. And I use the word rebuilding very intentionally because the fossil fuel system depends on continuously extracting and burning fuels. But a new system that intends to replace it also then tries to replace much of the same fuel consumption with an enormous build out of new equipment. And that requires very large quantities of minerals, at least from the beginning of the transition process. And the scale of this reconstruction or rebuilding is already unprecedented. In last year, 2025, the world had about 800 gigawatts of renewable power capacity. There were also more than 20 million electric cars sold globally. That translates to about one in every new car sold. And annual battery storage additions grew by approximately 70%. So this is not another marginal adjustment to our existing energy system. Indeed, it is a major physical reconstruction taking place, while the total demand for energy continues to grow due to new innovations like AI and the data centers that are increasingly being advocated for. So that means we need more generation, more grids, more storage, and ultimately more minerals. The other defining feature of the green transition is the urgency with which the transition projects are being pursued around the world. At COP28, almost 200 governments agreed to work towards tripling global renewable power capacity by the year 2030. And this is part of efforts to keep the 1.5-degree goal within reach. And that urgency is having a rather surprising moral judgment on justice-based advocacy. Most of the time, it sounds like if the transition is this urgent, then anyone who questions the project must be standing in the way of climate action. So communities who are often worried about needing more time, better evidence, and different texts before the project can proceed are often labeled, or they may appear to be opposed in the transition itself. But this also even happens when their concerns are legitimately about land, water, and even threats to their personal and community safety. And all of these then means that the demand for critical minerals will continue to grow, especially for the major ones that you see on the slide here. And in fact, under the current IEA's stated policy scenario, which is if things stay as they are, business as usual, we expect demand to continue to rise across all these minerals through to 2040. So meeting that demand also requires significant expansion in investment. The IEA estimates that copper, lithium, nickel, and cobalt alone will require more than 750 billion in US dollars in mining and refining investment between now and the year 2040. So the global decarbonization efforts is also an expansion of mineral extraction. And while the climate change and biodiversity conservation benefits we are pursuing in this transition are global and long-term, and indeed very important, the effects of the extraction activities are already immediate and often concentrated in already vulnerable communities. And that is, these communities are already experiencing the impacts in and around their landscapes as well as on their lives and livelihoods that are often tied to these landscapes as well. Now, if you take a look at the map on your screens, it shows where energy transition mineral projects are currently located globally, and then also tries to show how they overlap with lands of indigenous peoples and peasants. The research mapped over 5,000 critical mineral projects. Out of these, 69% were located on or near indigenous peoples or peasant lands. Among these projects that overlap with land-connected peoples, about 71% are in food insecure jurisdictions, 62% were in high water risk locations, and 23% within 50 kilometers of a recent violent conflict. This implies that many of the projects are located in communities where a new project can intersect with existing pressures on land, livelihoods, water, and even security. So there's a high chance that the mining projects would worsen the living conditions of people who are already under significant distress from these multiple pressures. And indeed, we are seeing many of these impacts play out in several parts of the world. A group of scholars, mostly based in Spain, have been mapping environmental conflicts through the Environmental Justice Atlas project. And it includes conservation, but as well as mining conflicts. Many of them are increasingly involving critical minerals. And what is emerging from the analysis of the archive is that for land-connected peoples, particularly indigenous peoples, landscapes, livelihoods, and their knowledge systems are among the things that are frequently threatened or lost or being damaged by the emergence of new critical mineral projects. In one of the recent articles which analyzed over 1,000 documented environmental conflicts involving indigenous peoples, what they found was that landscape loss was recorded in about 56% of the cases, livelihood loss in 52% of the cases, and dispossession, land dispossession was recorded in about half of the cases. There was also about 43% of the instances where participants reported that they lost their traditional knowledge as well. So the pressures that I showed you in the map are already being experienced in many communities around the world, especially communities that are already vulnerable. Now, the second part of what the Environmental Justice Atlas has been documenting is the role that environmental defenders play in pursuit of justice for land-connected communities. But before I return to share some of the findings in this area, I want to take a brief moment to explain what I actually mean by environmental defenders. These are often people and/or communities who work to protect land, livelihoods, and broadly speaking, ways of life. And an important part of the work environmental defenders do is making change at the community and local levels visible. And by doing so, they make it more actionable within policy and decision-making processes. So they often do this by observing the environmental changes happening in their communities, as well as the impacts that their communities and the peoples within the communities are experiencing. They then document those changes through various community-led knowledge production activities, including mapping or indigenous knowledge practices that they then mobilize to often challenge dominant narratives and practices around extraction activities. So in this way, what environmental defenders do is help connect the lived experiences of communities to the institutions that can either approve or stop or modify a project. So through this work, the defenders are considered critical for ensuring that the green transition is also just and fair to these land-connected peoples. In many existing cases that you would see in the Atlas, the work of these defenders has compelled better due diligence, succeeded in stopping harmful projects, or has helped at least to obtain some remedy when it's shown that some injustice had occurred. But that same work often exposes them to the violence that I've been talking about. And this violence that I just talked about is unfortunately happening at an alarming rate. between the year 2012 and 2024, the Global Witness has documented over 2,000 land and environmental defenders who were either killed or disappeared around the world. And we believe this is largely underreported because many of the cases are never reported, while many of the reports cannot also be independently confirmed. So most of these are left out of this data set. And the figure also leaves out a much wider pattern that we know, which often concerns threats, arrest, harassment, criminalization, and other forms of violence that defenders experience. But nonetheless, that is still a huge number. We are talking about an average of 173 murders or disappearance cases every year, or about more than 3 every single week. Now, when we see numbers of this magnitude, many of us may instinctively start to picture maybe there was a confrontation, like a protest or a clash that somehow escalated, leading to someone losing their life. But that's often not the case in many of these incidents. Unfortunately, I couldn't secure permission to show you the full images here, so I had to blur them out a little bit at the last minute. But I'll try my best to paint a picture of what's happening on this slide. The first image on the top is a picture of Bruno Pereira. Bruno was a Brazilian indigenous rights expert and a former official of FUNAN, which is Brazil's Indigenous Affairs Agency. And he had helped train indigenous patrols in the Javari Valley to use GPS, drone technology, and photography and maps to document illegal fishing and hunting and other forms of invasion happening within their territory. In 2022, he was traveling by boat together with a British journalist called Don Phillips, who was also researching a book about the Amazon. And they were unfortunately ambushed and killed on the way. The Brazil's federal police later concluded that the killings of these 2 men were in response to Bruno's monitoring activities against illegal fishing in the region. In fact, some reports say that they were killed the same day they had collected the evidence from the communities and were heading to present it to the authorities for the needed action to take place. Now, the second image below is that of Alberto Quatero. Alberto was an elected head of the Barangay Puyat in the Philippines. And in this region, nickel mining has been expanding for several years. Alberto had testified probably a week or 2 before his death on a case concerning documents used to advance the nickel exploration application. He had alleged that his own signature and those of other local officials had been forged on the Barangay resolutions to support the mining application. On September 22nd, 2024, he and his friend were also killed in a drive-by shooting. Some of the reports have alleged that his killing might be directly linked to his activities as an environmental defender. Now, neither of these protests were in any way a direct confrontation that might have led to the escalation. These were killings that happened in places that didn't involve any form of protest at all. And again, these 2 examples are not exceptional. In fact, it appears to be far too common within the context of critical minerals. The map you are seeing shows environmental conflicts involving critical minerals drawn from the Environmental Justice Atlas. I identified over 400 geocoded conflicts involving critical minerals from the dataset. The red points represent 169 conflicts in which the archive records both direct knowledge mobilization activities by defendants and the presence of repression or some form of violence happening. That's approximately 4 in every 10 conflicts within this archive that we are seeing, that dynamic of knowledge mobilization and violence. Now, the Atlas is a curated archive, so it is not a representative sample of all conflicts globally. In fact, many of the conflicts are not recorded here at all. You can see that, for example, in Central Africa, there's very little from the region and almost nothing from the DR Congo, even though the business and human rights inside Human Rights Resource Center reports more critical mineral-related allegations and violence there than any part of the world. Another thing is that this overlap is not necessarily proof that the evidence occurred because, the violence occurred because the knowledge activities were taking place. But I think it's large enough to raise two important questions. Why is it that knowledge mobilization and repression of violence so often appear in the same conflict context? And under what conditions can this knowledge be mobilized and to help affected communities achieve just outcomes? When I look more closely at the cases contained in the archive, I found that the co-occurrence between knowledge or epistemic activities and the presence of violence against defenders can be understood from two related perspectives. The first is that mining companies and regulatory institutions increasingly depend on knowledge from affected communities to understand the impacts of their activities, to establish whether consent exists and was secure, and to demonstrate compliance and legitimacy of the decision-making processes. In other words, the governance processes increasingly need this type of knowledge to remain credible. Now, the second aspect of the conversation here is that the defenders who produce and mobilize that knowledge are not consistently assured that their efforts will receive any fair consideration, and that is to be considered at all. And when I say fairness here, it extends beyond what happens to the knowledge after it has been produced and shared with the decision makers. It often includes whether those communities have the resources to produce the required evidence, whether they can produce it within safe context, and whether it will be recognized as legitimate knowledge at all. And finally, whether those institutions will explain how the knowledge that the defenders have produced informed the final decision. So there is a mismatch between the demand for this knowledge to establish governance credibility and the support that is granted to those who produce and share the knowledge. So I call this mismatch the epistemic accountability gap. And the way this gap operates is that it makes knowledge from affected communities consequential for governments, while at the same time leaving the producers and holders of that knowledge largely exposed to. So I'm going to unpack that first part of the gap a bit more here. So think about what often happens in a typical mining project situation. Before any company can demonstrate to a regulator that it should be allowed to proceed with any extraction activities, the current governance landscape generally expects it to support at least 5 broad items. The first is that they must show that it has assessed and understood the project's impact or potential environmental and social impacts. Second, they must show that the rights of affected communities have been respected and that the required consent has been obtained. Third, it must explain how it has addressed or how it plans to address any potential harms to people and the environment within the project location. And fourth, it must accurately report its environmental impacts and dependencies. Ultimate aim of ensuring that the decision to approve a project is legitimate and that it has the social license to operate. Sorry. Now, the way companies try to achieve these 5 broad aims is often through governance instruments such as environmental and social impact assessment, informed consultation and participation, or ICP for short, and in certain circumstances, especially involving indigenous peoples, free, prior, and informed consent or FPIC. So they use at times human rights and environmental due diligence, nature-related disclosures, and other mechanisms to establish the social license to operate. Right. But the important point is that each of these instruments and each of these claims that they often seek to prove relies on evidence, and much of that evidence can only come from the affected communities. So the communities are the ones that know what conditions existed prior to mining projects and how that has changed, as well as also they're able to tell how the mining activities are actually affecting the lives and values and priorities of the communities involved. And this is not to suggest that everything must depend on the situated knowledge of affected communities. Indeed, Western science and other technical studies remain very important for understanding these dynamics, but they often cannot independently supply this kind of situated and historical understanding and experiential knowledge that the communities can offer. More often than not, community knowledge will support technical assessments, add something that was missing, or contradict it altogether. And any of these potential outcomes are important for justice to be served and to be seen to be being served. Now, to the second part of the epistemic accountability gap, which is that environmental defenders are not consistently assured that their efforts will receive fair consideration. And again, looking across the cases behind those 169 overlapping conflict situations, I found that this often happens in two main ways. The first is that the knowledge may not be included in decision making at all, and it's mainly because communities do not have the resources needed to produce it. And then I'm sure as researchers, many of us can understand how much time, effort, and money it takes to collect, analyze, and to disseminate or to communicate data. And for many of these land-connected peoples, this is a particularly big ask because they often then have to translate their knowledge into forms that are existing systems considered to be rigorous or legitimate. And at times, they produce the knowledge through oral histories or lived observations, only for it to be dismissed as anecdotal. And because of the safety concerns I've been talking about, it may simply be unsafe to undertake any sort of knowledge production and mobilization work. The second instance is that defenders can go through all of these struggles, most times with the support of allied scientists or international NGOs, only for their evidence to go unanswered. This happens mainly because there's no clear duty to explain how their evidence was considered, and often no consequences for failing to respond to the concerns of communities. In many of these cases, affected communities experience both of sides of the gap at the same time. A good example is the lithium mining conflict at the Salar de Hombre-Muerto in Argentina. The indigenous community have found ways to produce and circulate evidence about the absence of free, prior, and informed consent, and also the lack of a cumulative hydrological baseline study in an already water-stressed basin. Yet in 2020, they had submitted a petition to the Los Pedros Aqueduct, concerning the Los Pedros Aqueduct, which went unanswered. And on 3 separate occasions, they were informed that the petition had been lost. And in 2024, a court suspended all new permits and ordered that the cumulative hydrological assessment should be conducted with significant community participation. So that obviously looks like good progress. But when the meeting was officially convened in 2025 to discuss the concerns the communities had about the project, the communities reported being asked to read approximately 2,000 pages and respond within 2 days. So on paper, the community was included in the process, but in practice, it was simply asked to carry the burden of producing and translating evidence. And unfortunately, without any sort of assurance that the institution will give that knowledge any form of meaningful response. And what this case has showed us is exactly why conventional participation alone is not enough if we are to achieve just outcomes within the green transition. The community was eventually given a place in the decision-making process. What it was not given was the authority to actually require an adequate response to their concerns. And it is my position that in situations like this, they persist because the affected communities are not given what I call standing, which is needed to hold the companies and regulators accountable for how their knowledge is used and even how the knowledge is produced in the first place. And at its simplest, accountability is simply a relationship in which one actor must explain and justify their decisions and actions to someone who can question that decision and judge the explanation that is provided. So in the diagram on this slide, the actor could be a mining company or a regulatory institution. The forum is the person or the body to whom that actor must explain their actions to. Now, the duty to provide an explanation is answerability, the possibility of change or to attach consequences if the explanation or the justification is not good enough is what gives that explanation some sort of relevance. But I want you to pay attention to the idea of standing, because I think that's the most important part of this whole discussion, is that we have to recognize the authority, give communities the recognized authority to be able to demand an account in the first place. Without that standing, everything else can be converted into exploiting the community for other gains without affording them the needed support. So often regulators currently are the ones that have standing because they can withhold a permit. Lenders also have standing because they can attach conditions to the financing agreements. And a court obviously also has standing because it can order a review, stop a project, or ask for remedies to be provided. Affected communities, on the other hand, often just allowed to attend meetings, submit evidence, file objections without receiving any sort of authority to require even a simple reasoned response in the process. So participation gives communities a place in the process. It's standing that determines whether the institutions must answer or respond to them. And the accountability ultimately flows towards whoever has that standing. So what does all of this mean, especially the lack of standing to communities have to do with the evidence of violence and the repression that I've been talking about? Well, I believe epistemic accountability and the gap makes contested knowledge dangerous in two ways, especially for the defendants who mobilize knowledge. The first is suppression. Community evidence can often challenge important claims about environmental impacts, the lack of consent or lack of compliance, or the entire legitimacy of a project. And when that happens, the actors who have an interest in protecting those claims may often attempt to either discredit the evidence, to criminalize who is producing it, intimidate them, or to attempt to silence them altogether, as we have seen. The second way is exposure. When defendants ultimately submit evidence through the formal channels and receive no meaningful response, they often take that evidence into more public and more exposed spaces like demonstrations or direct actions, and even media advocacy. But these strategies are what then makes them visible to the people who are looking to stop those contestations from happening. So the gap creates two routes through which knowledge mobilization and repression can occur together. So defenders may be targeted because their evidence threatens the mainstream position, or when institutional channels are blocked, they are then pushed into struggles that leads them to being seen, being targeted, and potentially being murdered. So this is why knowledge can be both consequential and dangerous for the people producing it, and especially the lack standing protection or a reliable institutional response. Okay, so this leaves us with a very rather difficult and still very practical challenge that needs to address. How do we make community knowledge useful without making the people who produce it more vulnerable? This question is crucial because decisions about critical mineral projects will continue to be made anyway. But without evidence from the affected communities, those decisions may rest on a much weaker understanding of the land, the water, and the livelihoods, as well as the harms that the communities living within the area are experiencing. And the absence of these alternative evidence bases is often easily interpreted as the absence of harm or opposition, or that the communities do not have any alternative priorities. At the same time, it's simply unfair for us to continue asking environmental defenders to produce this important evidence while leaving them to carry all the costs and risks by themselves. That's essentially like us asking communities to choose between being heard and being safe. And in the next couple of slides, what I will be doing is to try and share some of the conditions under which this dilemma happens and how knowledge might be mobilized while reducing the risks to these defenders. To understand these conditions, I want to draw on an earlier comparative study of 25 conservation conflicts involving environmental defenders. I asked a fairly straightforward question, and it's that what combination of strategies enabled environmental defenders to achieve the changes that they were fighting for, mostly stopping the harmful project, securing new protection, or obtaining some form of remedy if the outcome has already happened. And we used a crisp set qualitative comparative analysis. This approach, rather than picking separate strategies and trying to ask if they worked, QCA tried to identify combinations of conditions that repeatedly appear in successful cases. And the analysis identified 4 pathways that defenders employ within the data set to successfully mobilize against harmful or unjust projects. Here I'm just showing the 2 major pathways and those with the strongest empirical support. I think these 2 pathways covered about 9 of 13 successful cases within the data set. And you can see the first pathway to my left is what I call the epistemic legal pathway. And in this pathway, defendants combine knowledge production with legal action. And they notably often avoided using direct action tactics in the process. The knowledge then gives them the legal basis to go to court to try and seek redress. The second pathway, the epistemic coalition pathway, the defenders often combine their evidence with coalition building, and they rarely used lawsuits. In most of these cases, the knowledge provided them with a basis to gather support from public, media, and international support. And that also helps make their concerns public and make it more influential within the policy arenas. So knowledge production became consequential when it had some sort of a route through which it could acquire either institutional authority through the law or broader political reach through building coalition and support. Another observation was that the strategies available to environmental defenders are also shaped by sort of the risks and institutional conditions surrounding the context where they operate. As part of our sensitivity analysis, we examined 2 contextual conditions, and the first was to see whether indigenous peoples were involved, and the second was to examine if the mobilization was occurring in highly repressive political environments. What we see is that when indigenous peoples were involved, non-confrontational and preventive strategies appear more frequently. This often includes producing the evidence early, receiving formal complaints, and actively trying to stop the harm before it gains any momentum at all. This is because most times when companies invest resources in the process, it becomes difficult to leave all of that on the table and leave. And we also found similar patterns within the repressive environment. What these patterns show is that defenders adapt their strategies to the level of danger they face and their access to institutions and the political opportunities available to them. But we also found that there was generally a problem with how indigenous knowledge mobilization is often treated. Most global databases more readily recognize the activities that resemble scientific studies or reports that are written in technical and informal formats, survey formats. But because indigenous knowledge practices are often expressed through oral histories or land-based observations, they may mostly be under-recorded. So community knowledge is central for achieving just outcomes, but whether it can be mobilized effectively and safely largely depends on the institutional environment. And that then brings me to my final question for today's topic, which is, has our current institutional and policy environment provide these enabling conditions that are needed to support the mobilization of knowledge by affected communities? And if not, what is required to do so? Now, the short answer to the question is we are doing this partly because I think the foundations already exist, but the obligations to make them work remain largely fragmented. But at least the good news is we are not starting from zero. Some of the key institutional leverages that we currently have will include options like the UN-DRIP, which provides perhaps some of the strongest foundations for indigenous peoples. UN-DRIP recognizes self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, control over traditional knowledge and redress, especially when rights are violated. The only issue is that its protections are specifically framed around indigenous peoples. So there's obviously lots of other vulnerable groups that wouldn't benefit from this. The second one is UN-DROP, which extends some of the protections within UN-DRIP to related groups such as peasants and other people working in rural land-based contexts. And UN recognizes rights to participation and information, as well as the rights connected to land, natural resources, as well as traditional knowledge. One of the agreements, which is currently only based in Latin America and Caribbean, the Epistemic agreement actually brings together a lot of these pieces, including access to environmental information, public participation, and access to justice. Which also interestingly has an explicit protection for environmental defenders. One of the things that makes the schedule particularly important for today's conversation is it is legally binding for its parties. But like I said, it only currently covers specific regions. So the majority of the world still lacks some of these protections. And then we have the more recent UN Guiding Principles on Critical Energy Transition Minerals, which provides a global framework based on human rights, equity, transparency, traceability, and accountability. So what we see is that so many of the elements that we need to address the concern of violence and injustices within the context of knowledge production by defenders already exist. The problem is that they cover different groups, apply in different regions, carry different levels of legal force, and are often implemented unevenly. I think partly because most of them are declaratory, they are not binding. So more importantly, they do not also operate as an integrated set of obligations around the full process through which knowledge is often produced at the community level, protected, submitted, and used in decision-making processes. So the problem of accountability persists despite the presence of all of these available tools. So we may be thinking, okay, well, the fragmentation is a problem of implementation, but it also often then means that the community may have the right to participate without the resources that are needed to produce the evidence. They may even produce the evidence and then they will not be responded to. So the result is often a policy landscape that invites communities to produce knowledge and bring it in for decision making without consistently supporting its production, protecting its holders, or ensuring that the institutions or the users of that knowledge will respond to the producers of it. So to address this issue of fragmentation, what I'm proposing is to move from simply seeking to include community knowledge to building more accountability relationships around it. So the framework I'm proposing is RRP, which is essentially a synthesis of these existing commitments across the existing governance landscape. And what RRP seeks to do is to bring together 4 reciprocal obligations that should apply whenever governments companies, financiers, or other institutions depend on knowledge from affected communities for governance purposes, or when they should depend on the knowledge of affected communities for their decision making. Now, the first element of the framework is recognition. Recognition means accepting community knowledge as legitimate, including in the forms in which the communities produce and communicate. So we shouldn't be expecting communities to translate their evidence into forms that Western science recognizes as rigorous or legitimate. Right? So communities should not have to do that. The second is resourcing. If communities need that, if institutions need that evidence, they must help provide time, funding, access to information, and independent expertise, as well as any other resources that these communities need to produce, document, circulate, and to mobilize it. So the third one is protection. I think most of this talk has been about the risks defenders face, but this dimension means we need to protect both the people who produce the knowledge, and as some of the earlier slides I showed revealed, also to even protect the knowledge system that sustains the production of especially indigenous knowledge systems. So that includes protection from physical violence, but also from intimidation and appropriation, or the safe disclosure of sensitive community-based knowledge. Then the final and fourth item is answerability. Institutions should be required to explain what evidence they received, how they assessed it, and how it affected the final decision. Where it wasn't used at all, set aside, they should explain why, because communities must have an opportunity to challenge that account. So these four obligations together will help change the relationship and shift the current need to include and give communities the opportunities to participate, to building more epistemic accountability that creates corresponding duties for the institutions to show how that knowledge is being used and how it's being produced. So that's how I think we can begin making knowledge mobilization safer for its holders and more capable of contributing to just outcomes. So, right. Now, given recent happenings around the world, especially within the context of critical minerals and the green transition broadly, I think the timing of this conversation is particularly important. The UN critical minerals agenda has moved quite rapidly over the last 3 years. In 2024, the Secretary General's panel of critical energy transition minerals established 7 guiding principles and 5 recommendations that placed human rights, equity, transparency, and accountability at the center of governance of critical minerals. In 2025, the UN guidance for action began to translate those principles into practical measures. And then the UN task force, which was created to coordinate the implementation and provide support for country-level actions, also was set up in the year 2025. Just recently, about a few weeks ago, the UN held its first high-level meeting on critical energy transition minerals. So we are currently entering the critical phase of implementation, and governments and international institutions are deciding how these principles will shape actual rules, investments, and projects. So this is, I think, an opportune time for some of the RRP obligations to be actively integrated into some of these conversations. The obligations can be embedded in practical areas such as permitting processes, due diligence, project finance, and grievance systems. And in each of these areas, the basic requirement could be as straightforward as saying an institution that relies on knowledge, or that should rely on community knowledge, needs to explain how that knowledge was obtained, whether the communities were adequately resourced to produce it, how its holders are protected, and how it was weighed in the final decision before an extraction project is allowed to proceed. That explanation should also be in a form that allows communities to contest it, to understand it, to challenge it. So that is, in my opinion, how we can move from the current golden three principles to build more reciprocal relationships around knowledge, accountability, and justice. Right, that brings me to the end of my presentation today. But before I hand over for discussion, I would like to acknowledge funding from SHEC, as well as the institutional and intellectual support that the University of Manitoba, APES, and the University of Waterloo have provided in different parts of this project. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you so much, Raphael, for your fantastic and deeply compelling presentation. The distinction you drew between superficial community inclusion and true institutional and stability, along with your proposed RPA framework, provides a valid roadmap as global critical mineral governance continues to evolve. We'll now transition into our interactive Q&A session. As a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions directly into the chat box, and I'll read them out for Dr. Ayuri. Do we have any questions in the board? Yeah. Dr. Grace.
All right, thank you. Raphael, that's quite humbling, I would say, because it got us quiet and reflective. The perspective into this critical mineral. What's out there generically is we know that those who are benefiting from it are different from those who are suffering, from the mining. But this talk brought a completely different perspective, to the inequality, the structural inequality. And I would like to start by borrowing the brainchild of my colleague, Dr. Abraham. Maybe you'll be able to say it better. That when you observe disadvantages, you need to also recognize the system that fits, that disadvantage. So disadvantages or vulnerability is actually a system. It's not about the people who are disadvantaged, but there is a system feeding it. And this is kind of the scenario you've also brought out. But in everything, as I'm reflecting, I'm just curious. We're not oblivious of the society we're in. Many of us have lived experience in it. So everything you've talked about today, just factor in corruption. And now let's trace who are we actually addressing by saying this solution, RRPA, who should really take it up? Who are we addressing? Who is this who? Who is this they, that must act on this? Because critical mineral, people, sitting in the global north, they don't want to compromise on the quality of the air, on the quality of their water, on the quality of their technology, and all that. And from what you said, it will continue to increase. The people are making tons, loads of money from here, So who are we talking about to take on this responsibility? And do not forget, don't answer me by saying UN, because we're also a UN entity. UN does not have the mandate to enforce. So in your reflections from what you have seen, because you've really done, quite a lot of work just deep diving into this. So who are we really addressing?
Okay, great. That's a really good question, and I think it's probably the most important next question for this type of conversation, and specifically because the most recent negotiations around critical minerals at the last minute, all content around critical minerals had to be dropped from the negotiations, right? And in the past, there has been proposals to give communities veto power to essentially stop projects if they don't agree with it, and that has been actively rejected by several countries. And so we haven't made any progress in giving communities that much power. So I'm very much aware of the global resistance that often comes with these types of conversation. But I think to answer the question of who we are addressing, we need to address the people who the consequences would have an impact on their interests, right? So an example is the companies, right? If we are able to create a global consciousness to the extent that our countries can know that giving communities more time and allowing communities knowledge to have an influence in the process doesn't mean the project is not going to proceed at all. I mean, in fact, with the evidence has shown that there were several instances where communities, through their protests, found a resolution together with companies and the regulators. So it is not always a lose-lose situation as they often begin. And I think that's the mistake that the global community needs to actively try to rectify. That when we say pay attention to the knowledge that these communities are producing, we are not saying the project is not going to proceed. If you work in science like many of us do, what we find is that you can have conflicting evidence, but we always find a resolution. So my decision to actually focus on knowledge is because I think knowledge is one of the areas that we can compromise and find a common ground. If we leave knowledge out and then we focus on the politics of interest and the politics of power, at the end of the day, we don't make progress. So I think I'm addressing still the global community, including the UN, but I'm asking for attention to move towards looking at what the evidence leads us rather than what our interest and then power leads us to. So you are right to question if they are going to listen. But if they listen to knowledge, maybe they might change their stance.
Thank you very much. We have a question from.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk and the way you're uplifting all of the challenges that people who provide knowledge give, and the fact that knowledge is power, and we can use it as a way of finding common ground. I'm also thinking about the way you opened with the quote from the report about preventing sacrifice zones, and like now we pay for carbon offsetting, or every time you take a flight, or you can there's so many ecosystem services that we pay for, whether it's watershed protection, and I'm wondering if you think some sort of form of payment for ecosystem knowledge could work, and what the risks to something like that could be.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, I think in short, I think it could work. Payment for ecosystem services could work. Why? Because it's working in some other context already. So there's no reason for us to believe that it wouldn't work. I think the main challenge that we need to be looking at is what are the structures that we could channel some of these resources. And I think one of the recent initiatives within the CBD context, which excites me, is the establishment of the Article 8J and the recent Cali Fund, which essentially says we should finance community-based knowledge. But for now, it's mostly focused on genetic activity and helping support the production of that kind of knowledge and the protection of it. So that's one sort of current institutional structure that we could begin to channel some form of payment of ecosystem services. If I were to use the example of the flight that you're talking about, if we were to even add 0.001% on that, and then we channel that sort of price, money to an institution set up within maybe the UN critical minerals structure, that could then go to communities that are looking for resources to mobilize knowledge and to assess the impact of proposed projects on their life. So yeah, I think it could work. We still need to figure out the structures, and I think we already have some of the cases to show us how we might implement such a strategy.
All right, thank you for that compelling answer. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, which brings us to the end of today's Q&A session. So thank you once again, Dr. Rafaela Ibiri, for sharing your timely and transformative research with us today. And thank you for our global audience for your active participation and continued engagement with UNU-INWEH's work. As a final reminder, today's session was recorded and will be available on demand shortly on our website at UNU.edu/INWEH/science/talks and via our YouTube channel. So thank you all for joining us today, and we'll look forward to welcoming you in our next UNU-INWEH Science Talk. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming to listen to me.